everybody agrees if you treat it early on, you can cure it with 2 to 4 weeks of antibiotics. But the problem is the test doesn't work in the first month. Later on, it's no better than a coin flip. So you have all these people going forward having these chronic symptoms, and the major medical society, the infectious disease society, says you can't have, even if you are treated for that, the symptoms go away and those same symptoms come back. You can't have any more antibiotics because chronic Lyme doesn't exist. We think there's no more organisms in your body, and it's just an autoimmune condition where your body's attacking itself, or it's debris from killing off those organisms. So it creates this catch-22 for patients where it takes, like us, a year to get diagnosed, and we had multiple tick-borne diseases. And then when you do have the chronic symptoms, they won't treat you.
Hello, a very warm welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're going to discuss an uncomfortable, and some would even say creepy, topic: ticks. Their ever-expanding population and huge rise of tick-borne diseases, especially Lyme disease, is a cause of urgent concern for all of us, not just for those living in the Northeast. Ticks are prodigious vectors, and they're on the march, expanding their range and numbers to pick up new pathogens and transmit diseases to new regions of the United States, Canada, and beyond. But today's program is not designed to panic you. It's rather to prepare you. We have 3 experts with us today going to be explaining why this tick expansion is occurring, the scale of the problem, why Lyme testing and treatment are so inadequate, and what we can do about it. I think the large number of audience questions we've already received today is indicative of the scale of the problem. So the 3 guests we have today, welcome to all of you, are Brian Owens, a Canadian science journalist whose works appeared in Nature, New Scientist and The Lancet. His recent book, Lyme Disease in Canada, came out last summer. Chris Newby is a science writer, author of Bitten, and senior producer of the documentary Under the Skin. She joins us from Utah. And finally, Dr. Nev Zubcevic is a Harvard-trained physician specializing in physical medicine and rehab. She's currently the CMO of Invisible International, which is a nonprofit working to alleviate suffering caused by invisible disease. Nev is joining us from Hawaii. So welcome to all of you. Okay, let's start. We've got a lot of material to get through today. We're not going to deal with the origins of this disease or speculations about it. We just don't have time today. So we're going to start by talking about the scale of the problem. Tick saliva carries up to 18 tick-borne pathogens in the United States and 27 known globally. The disease that gets most attention is Lyme, which is now apparently raging out of control across America and into Canada. The disease already exists in Europe and other parts of the world. So Brian, let's go up to you there in Canada. Hello.
Hello.
You learned a lot, I imagine, about this disease while you were writing the book. Did anything really surprise you other than the fact that your dog could get a vaccine and you couldn't?
I think one of the things that really surprised me was kind of how quickly it was moving, I guess, in Canada. For years, we were told that there was only one tiny little part in southern Ontario, and that was the only place that there were ticks. It was the only endemic population that had Lyme. But now we know it's across most of eastern Canada. It's in western Canada up the west coast. And it's moving really quickly, a lot of it driven by climate change. The range of the ticks is expanding by something like 30 kilometers north every year. And I guess the Lyme-infected ticks are following close behind that kind of leading edge. So that was really the kind of the first thing that got me, was that the scale of the problem was a lot bigger than we'd had heard here in Canada before. And then, like you said, obviously the situation with the vaccines, wasn't something I was aware of before I started researching the book. Just how there had been a vaccine and then it just kind of went away.
So just to kind of fast track through that story. So GlaxoSmithKline developed this in the 1990s, and it did get distributed a little bit in Canada and North America. And then what happened? The anti-MMR people at the time took lawsuits straight against the pharmaceutical company, and it wasn't lucrative or feasible for them to continue producing it. Is that right?
Yeah, the vaccine was released in kind of the late 1990s, early 2000s. It was fairly successful, but it had some drawbacks. It was a 3-dose series, which, as we're seeing with COVID vaccines, the more doses are in a series, the sort of harder it is to get people to do it or to complete it. It wasn't added to sort of a routine vaccination schedule. It wasn't available for children. And then it also had this problem of coming out right around the time that the sort of anti-vax movement was taking off with the thoroughly debunked now links between MMR and autism. Mm-hmm. And so this kind of general feeling of anti-vax or anti-vax feelings was sort of being stirred up. And there was a potential because there had been a lot of reports, sort of anecdotal reports of arthritis after the vaccine, which was a sort of a potential problem, given that arthritis is one of the things that Lyme disease causes. That was something that needs to be looked at. But what ended up happening is that the vaccine wasn't added to this list of sort of protected vaccines that where the companies are kind of pay a little tax and then they're protected against lawsuits. So all these kind of lawsuits started coming in, and GSK just decided, it's not getting the take up we wanted, and we're having all these kind of vexatious lawsuits. So they just said, well, forget it. It's as far as I know, the only successful vaccine that was voluntarily withdrawn from the market, just because they sort of couldn't be bothered to deal with it. And then that ended up sort of poisoning the well. There was a second vaccine being developed around the same time. And again, that company just said, no, we're not even going to bother bringing this one forward because it's just too much hassle.
So what do you think in Canada is the next step in terms of public awareness? And what's the next stage, to your knowledge, about the French vaccine?
Well, yeah, so there is another vaccine that's being developed now. It's they've done a few things, kind of tweaks to try and deal with some of the concerns around potential side effects. And they are hoping to release it in the next couple of years. One of the things about this is it takes a long time to develop a Lyme disease vaccine, because you need to do your clinical trials over the course of 2, 3, 4 years, because you need at least kind of 2 life cycles of ticks to cycle through, or 2 Lyme seasons to get through. So we can't see the sort of speed we've seen with the COVID vaccines. You just don't get, aren't enough people being infected each year to get the statistical power to do it really quickly. So they're hoping, I believe around 2024, they'd like to release that. It should be a bit more, I believe it's down to 2 doses, so it's a bit easier to do that way. And they're looking to release it in Europe, North America, Canada, and US, which should give it a broader kind of acceptance or a broader market for them to go, that even if they have some pushback, they'll have other places they can sell it as well.
And just generally, are people worried about this in Canada? I mean, do you think that the general consensus is that it's not our problem, or are they aware that it is becoming a problem?
A lot of people are, yeah. I mean, I have several friends who've had Lyme disease and went through, the sort of the usual thing of struggling to get a proper diagnosis. It's a smaller, I guess, sort of community of Lyme patients in Canada than in the US, but they're just as vocal. There's quite a few politicians who are taking this quite seriously. Canada does have a national strategy now to deal with it, although that is, of course, the implementation of that is always being kind of argued about a little bit. But generally, it's, for the parts of Canada where most people live, which is the southern part, it is a problem, and more people are sort of becoming aware of that problem and taking the steps that they need to protect themselves.
And of course, so the financial aspect would be different for people in Canada because there's national health.
Yeah, well, so if you do get an official diagnosis, then you're fine. You'll get the treatment that's available. But a lot of Canadians, because there is this trouble with getting the diagnosis, end up paying a lot out of pocket to go to either naturopaths, or often will travel to the United States to doctors and pay out of pocket in the United States to get prescriptions there that doctors in Canada either can't or are unwilling to give them.
So it sounds like they're not dealing with it that well in that regard.
That would certainly be the case that a lot of Lyme patients would make. Yeah.
So welcome. We're going over to Chris now. Chris, in addition to producing the documentary Under the Skin, which really opened the can of worms for a lot of people to see the scale of the problem, and you wrote the book as well, Bitten, you and your husband both got Lyme at the same time. Great difficulty in getting diagnosed, obtaining the proper treatment, and it actually had to become your own advocates in the end to get the treatment you needed, and pay for it. And like many long-term sufferers in the film, you also were accused of having these psychosomatic symptoms, which these poor long-suffering people often end up with. Oh, you're imagining it, or whatever the story is. So very briefly, could you just give us kind of a synopsis of your story? And then we'll watch a quick clip of the film. I think you're mute there.
When my husband and I were in our early 40s, we took a family vacation to Martha's Vineyard, and we were there about a week. And when we got back to California, my husband and I were sicker than we'd ever been before. Our kids didn't get it. And that started this long process. We had done tick checks, but somehow we had gotten bitten by a tick, but we didn't know it. But we went into the medical system. We were told we had very intense flu-like symptoms. And we went to the doctor that said, oh, it's a virus, go away. We came back in less than a week and said, no, we are really, really sick. I mean, we could barely climb up the stairs to go to bed at night. And they said, no, we think it's a virus, but hey, we'll let you see the infectious disease doctors. And in the US system, the specialists are hard to get into. So we went to specialists after specialists, and every doctor we saw, in a year, we saw 10 doctors, and we ended up spending about $60,000. And it took a year to get diagnosed with 2 tick-borne diseases. And so finally, we got to the Academic Medical Center near my house, and they finally tested us for Lyme disease. I came up positive, and they said, well, that test is a really bad test. We're going to ignore it. And so then I went home and read about, well, Lyme disease. I mean, we'd been tested for maybe 20 diseases, and this is the first positive. And I learned that they should have tested us for a second time. So I made them do that, and it came up positive again. And they said, you know, we don't think it's Lyme disease. It would be like winning the lottery for you both to get it. The last doctor we'd been to thought that it was a psychosomatic couples thing where we were making up all these symptoms. So 10 months into the disease, we had like chronic fatigue symptoms like Alzheimer's, like early onset dementia, pains would move around. We had irritable bowel syndrome, all those that would change every day. And he thought I was a hypochondriac and I was trying to get attention from my husband, and he was having empathy pain. So it was just outrageous. Every doctor we saw, I'm an engineer, so I document everything. I said, hey, we visited an island off Massachusetts, which was the #2 spot for Lyme disease. And none of the doctors till the academic medical system tested me. And then when they did test me, they ignored the results. So it was just, what was wrong? We were fired by the last set of infectious disease doctors, and I went on Google, and we found a Lyme specialist in our neighborhood, and she didn't take insurance, but once we were under her care, we got better slowly. And so a year undiagnosed, and then it was almost 5 years before we were totally symptom-free.
Wow, that's quite harrowing. It's quite harrowing. So you typify a lot of people that I say that must affect the numbers that are documented of having Lyme. I mean, the CDC have quite a low park figure of real infections, and then they also say these people were treated, right? So they say 500,000 or close to it a year. That's a lot of people. New cases per year. But then they'll say, but maybe only 35,000 people actually had the disease. And then we all know that the disease test is useless. So this is almost a joke this kind of documentation of cases. It's not reliable, it's underestimated. And then you've got also on your site saying 36% of the sufferers show long Lyme symptoms 6 months after the initial treatment, a third of them. So I think you said your husband was one of those that had, when he got infected with COVID, he found that he had a flare up of a lot of his old problems that he'd had. Is that right, with Lyme?
Yeah, he's had a couple relapses and then he got long COVID. So it's hard to say. He refuses to test for Lyme because he says the tests are just so worthless. I mean, everybody agrees if you treat it early on, you can cure it with 2 to 4 weeks of antibiotics. But the problem is the test doesn't work in the first month. Later on, it's no better than a coin flip. So you have all these people going forward, having these chronic symptoms, and the major medical society, the Infectious Disease Society, says you can't have, even if you are treated for that, the symptoms go away and those same symptoms come back. You can't have any more antibiotics because chronic Lyme doesn't exist. We think there's no more organisms in your body, and it's just an autoimmune condition where your body's attacking itself, or it's debris from killing off those organisms. So it creates this catch-22 for patients where it takes, like us, a year to get diagnosed, and we had multiple tick-borne diseases. And then when you do have the chronic symptoms, they won't treat you. So it creates a vacuum, and people have to seek care outside of the insurance companies. It's really expensive. People go bankrupt. When one of the people in the couples has it and the other one doesn't, they don't understand because you can't see the symptoms. It's an invisible disease. And people lose their jobs. They have to drop out of college. I think the societal and the economic impacts of this disease are just incalculable because we can't track it right now. We don't have a code. Well, January 1, now we have a code for chronic Lyme, but we didn't before January 1.
Well, that's good to know. So that would mean it encompasses more types of conditions.
Right. So before the WHO on January 1 enacted these new codes, there was only chronic Lyme. I mean, there was only acute Lyme and arthritis and neuropathy, numbness. And it ignored some of the more serious manifestations of Lyme disease, like heart disease, eye problems, the gut problems, congenital Lyme, passing it to unborn children. So now at least we can track it, and the data researchers can calculate the burden of the disease to society and then go back to Congress and say, hey, you need to fund this disease.
Before we talk about that, because that's an important one, and why it's so hard to test and why it's so hard to treat, with Dr. Nev, perhaps we could just watch a clip of the documentary.
If you think about how many people are probably infected, it's scary. How many people could actually be very, very sick.
6 times the number of HIV cases, 50% higher than the number of breast cancer cases. It's a huge problem.
I thought I would either die or live with this pain forever. It was almost like you have your life taken away from you.
This had tremendous effect on my wife and on my children, and this family is no more.
We didn't really know what we were getting into. You just feel like you're in the water and it's up to your head.
It's known as Lyme disease. Thousands suffer from it.
La maladie de Lyme, elle touchera entre 10 000 personnes en France chaque année.
Die Zahl gefährlicher Borreliose-Erkrankungen ist deutlich gestiegen.
A man has died, but yet again, authorities refuse to acknowledge the disease.
That gives us quite a good view of the implications worldwide and social, economic, emotional weight of this, apart from the physical manifestations. It's quite something. Okay, I'd like to invite Dr. Nev to the conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You're a Harvard-trained physician, and you're the Chief Medical Officer of Invisible International, which is a nonprofit that tries to alleviate the sufferings caused by these invisible diseases, and Lyme being one of them. why is it, first of all, it's so damn hard to test for this thing? Why does it elude us in a way that we were able to get a test for the COVID virus pretty rapidly?
So one of the main reasons why this test was developed, or the reason why this test was developed, was for surveillance. This test was never meant to be diagnostic test, actually. And so when this was developed decades ago, folks were really supposed to be using it for surveillance only. But because there was nothing else, we started using the test for diagnostic purposes. And really, the problem with this test is that there isn't a worldwide standard. So when you're tested in China versus in Europe or in the United States, the test will be interpreted differently. So Chinese papers suggest that one of the Western blot Lyme-specific bands is sufficient for you to diagnose somebody, whereas in the US, there's an arbitrary number of 5, completely chosen arbitrarily. There's no reason why it should be 5. In Europe, it's 2 or 3. Depends on your luck where you're tested, depends on your luck whether your physician recognizes that this is a surveillance test. It has nothing to do with really good science that's specifically honed in on diagnostics of humans. And so, and also the lack of funding, because we really were not and still are not keeping track of the majority of tick-borne illnesses. So we don't count the numbers of anaplasmosis, Ehrlichia, babesia across the states. We don't know what the incidence is. We're only really partially tracking Lyme for those states that are funded to do better surveillance because of lack of funding. So it's kind of like a catch-22. You have to start tracking it to then alert the public, hey, this is a big issue. We should be having better tests. And then the NIH would invest more money into sponsoring diagnostic labs to develop a better test. And then that better test can be used to diagnose people to then keep track of them. So I think that really the only answer for us to move quicker in this is for the NIH to designate a larger bucket of finances to support better diagnostics so we can diagnose people better.
Yeah, that would seem to me pretty key, because you can't lobby for something if people are saying it doesn't exist. It's very difficult to put a case together. The people, manifest so many different symptoms. Some doctors say that they're not symptoms at all and it's psychosomatic. So you're in this terrible loop. And then with Chris's case, Chris didn't get a diagnosis till quite late. So you can actually have it for a couple of years before you even know that you've got it.
Yeah, I would say there's some really good data on LymeDisease.org that shows we were the lucky ones, because we got treated under a year. So there was a chance that we could get back to normal. But the people who are misdiagnosed for, 2, 3, 4 years, it's harder for them.
Okay, we've just pulled up for people, we're going to post this link to this research that Yale is doing. Dr. Nev, you spoke to me about this earlier. You think this is quite promising because it's using some of the technology, the messenger RNA that was used to develop the COVID vaccine, and it zones in on the tick saliva rather than the disease. Is that right? Perhaps you could...
That's right. That's right. Actually, there was quite promising research coming out from Yale even in 2009 by Dr. Errol Fickrig, who had really was interested in obliterating all infections that a tick can give somebody, because having just a Lyme vaccine kind of gives you a false sense of security that, you could go hiking now and you won't be affected, but there's still, over 20 organisms that could create potentially chronic illness and a devastating illness in a patient. So really targeting all of them together is a holy grail of this, vaccine potential that we have to develop as a society. So Errol Fickrig and his colleagues at Yale have most recently published a really great potential new technology that is utilizing mRNA to address the tick saliva proteins, and with that, prevent organisms of any kind of entering the mammalian species. So that's vaccinated. So in my opinion, I would love to see that that's where the funding from NIH and Big Pharma goes, because receiving a vaccine like that would really obliterate a lot of our concerns from tick-borne disease as a whole.
Of course, my little idea, which I was trying to get my son interested in, was to create some kind of electronic device, like a wand, that you could wave over your body that would beep if there was a tick on you instantly. So that would be like this fail-safe thing that when you come home from a walk, you can do that straight away on your kids. And, you know, because sometimes you don't see these things, or they drop off and they've bitten you. So let's go to that. Let's talk about why there's such an increase, A, in the numbers, and B, in the spread of this. What are the key components in causing that? I know climate change has definitely had something to do with it, because I was reading that we now have ticks in parts of California that they never had ticks before. And also lack of habitat. We encroach on habitat, the deer populations increase, they're all hoarded together. And then, you know, you go out in the garden, you're not hiking, you're just gardening. And you don't think you have to put the same kind of, you know, precautions in place as you do when you go hiking in the woods. But in fact, what would you say to that, Dr. Nev?
So I think as a society, because, you know, diagnostics, it's going to take time, treatment strategies, you know, it's going to take time to really validate protocols. But prevention is something we can do today. And as you said, you know, I wish there was a wand that could tell you, but there isn't one yet. However, we could spray our clothes with permethrin before we go on a hike. And when you spray it with permethrin, then you secure that a tick will not attach to your clothing or your shoes. That's very easy and very inexpensive to do. You know, for $15, you can get a spray bottle, take your clothes and your boots outside, spray down, and voila, you know, you have removed one big potential, you know, risk factor of the tick attaching to your clothes or your boots, and you're bringing it to your house or on your skin. Second thing that has actually, there's a research study on this, and it was a teenager who had tried this, and it was amazing. But then studies were also done to just put your clothes in the dryer and fry the ticks, you know. So after a hike, you undress, you put everything in the dryer before you put it in the washer on high heat, and that will desiccate the tick. So that's another great strategy, and you can reuse that clothing next time, and you know that it's been tick-free. Also doing a tick check every time you're gardening, you're outdoors, you're wearing your permethrin clothing, but when you're taking it off, potentially, you know, one could drop onto your hairline or somewhere, and they're so small. I mean, they can fit into the D of the dime, right? And so you want to really go get in a hot shower, feel around your skin, even put some conditioner on your fingers, and just kind of go all over your body, all the crevices where ticks like to hide. And then if you do end up finding a tick that's attached to you, the chances are you caught it early and it's had less chance to transmit disease. Second, you can take it and send it out for testing and to see if the tick was carrying any illness. And third, you can report it to your physician. So all those ways are something we can all start doing today to really help the public. And then last, but probably the most important thing we could do is really advocate for more funding for our local departments of health, who could potentially, with more funding, be putting up signs in parks and by rivers and areas where people tend to sit on the grass to warn people that this is where Lyme could be acquired, and to just say, hey, be careful, ticks are here, kind of like what you see in Cambridge parks where it says mosquitoes could be here because we know West Nile virus is spreadable. You know, and this way you also warn people about ticks. So half of the battle would be just to really hone in on prevention at this time while we're working on the other things.
Yeah, actually, I think we've got a picture somewhere of those signs in Paris. So when you go into a park in Paris, there's a sign that basically says, check your kids for ticks and don't sit in the grass, right? which
Right.
I don't think I've ever seen that here. I mean, I don't know if anybody else has, but I've never seen anything, signs for ticks. I think somebody said in New Hampshire they once saw a sign in the woods saying beware of ticks, but that was the end of it. It didn't give you any advice. So these little placards in Paris, do they actually suggest some things as advice?
To be aware that there's ticks and Lyme disease, and I think that alone, will prevent a lot of people from acquiring it because they will avoid sitting in the grass.
Also,
or check their children.
Excuse me for interrupting. You mentioned dropping the tick into your doctor's office. This is something else nobody else is doing. I know people that have had tick bites and they take the tick off, and that's it. They flush it down the loo.
Putting the tick in the zipper bag and, in your freezer, and then you can take a picture of it, but also you can mail that tick off for testing. And they test the tick for Lyme and other co-infections. Unfortunately, there's a relapsing fever Borrelia called Borrelia miyamotoi in the United States, and also another strain called Borrelia hermsii, for which we don't actually test. So you could be having Lyme-like symptoms and you're negative on the Lyme test, but no physician should ever say to their patient, you don't have Lyme disease, because we don't have tests for these relapsing fever Borrelia strains, which live in the bellies of the ticks in Massachusetts. I mean, we know Borrelia miyamotoi is there. In California is actually the predominant strain. So if you don't have a test for it, or you're not testing for it, then how will you ever know if your patient has it? So, I was a co-director of the Dean Center for Tick-borne Illness at Spalding Rehab Hospital in Boston for nearly 5 years. And, I never told my patients, you don't have Lyme, because I don't know, because the testing is, very inadequate. It just tests for 1 out of 52 strains of Borrelia. So if you look at the taxonomy of the bacterial species, there's 52 of them. And we only test for 1, and we test poorly by using a surveillance test only. So this is why clinicians should be educated to recognize a cluster of mixed symptoms as a potential tick-borne illness, especially in somebody who's healthy otherwise and there's nothing else going on, but they went on a hike or they were gardening. Most of my patients, if not all of them, that I saw, hundreds of them while I was working at Spalding, were really healthy, active individuals before getting a tick-borne illness. Nobody was a lazy person. And so it was very detrimental when you walk in as a patient to a physician's office with like a myriad of symptoms, from a headache, joint pain, numbness and tingling, anxiety, depression. And you're trying to tell all these symptoms, but doc only has 15 minutes to listen to you because they're limited by insurance reimbursement. The doc doesn't really have time to dive into all of these things. And so the easiest thing is to put it like a syndrome and say, well, you probably have fibromyalgia, anxiety, depression. And then by the time the patient actually gets diagnosed by a very early, if it's treated early, curable disease, and all those symptoms go away, it's like a miracle. And so most of my patients who I've treated even with late tick-borne illness improved and got their life back. So I think we need to be really looking at clinical diagnosis. While I was at faculty at Harvard and working at a Dean Center, I collaborated with the folks at Johns Hopkins and Columbia to develop the first academic validated questionnaire for Lyme disease. And I put in the link in our little chat. So it's called the General Symptom Questionnaire of 30 symptoms. So this makes it easy for a physician to just give the patient the symptom scale, and they could, because it's validated for Lyme specifically, you could actually see what the patient circles. And if they score high, then it allows you to, have a clinical diagnosis for this patient, give them a chance for treatment and see if they improve.
Okay, that's all very helpful. Somebody has asked for you to give the name of the spray again. If you could just say the name of it or type it into the...
It's permethrin, and I will type it here.
Okay.
There are also some less toxic versions. You can go online. There's some plant-based prevention sprays too, or you can buy, you can buy clothes that are pre-treated with those chemicals.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. It always seems a bit severe to put something that powerful on small children.
Actually, permethrin is used as a cream when you get scabies on everybody's skin. It's completely safe because mammals have an enzyme that actually processes that, whereas insects do not. So we use permethrin as a scabies cream on babies. So putting it outside of your clothing that, is on the outside of the clothing and the boots is completely safe and fine. And I would recommend that over something else. For the skin itself, there are consumer reports will list kind of the tested insect repellents every year and tell you which one is protecting from which insects like mosquitoes or ticks, and what their rating is, like, out of 10. So I think, or out of 100%. So lemon eucalyptus has traditionally been a really good one. But also, there's the DEET-based products, which some people prefer because they're more potent.
There's also one called Nootkatone, which is based on grapefruit, or extracted from grapefruits, which is, you can get extracts of it. I'm not sure how well those work, but there is one sort of an actual tick repellent being developed with that as a basis. And it's supposed to be quite successful, although I don't believe it's commercially available yet.
So people are asking about tick season in the chat room here. And unfortunately, I don't know the exact answer to that. I just worry that it's extended and extended because they seem terribly durable, these are. Could you speak to that, Brian, at all?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things about Canada is that it gets very cold in the winter. So we've kind of always felt that protects us from the ticks. But the ticks don't tend to bite in the winter, but they survive it no problem. They overwinter without any real trouble. They just go down into the leaf litter and they stay there, and then they pop up again in the spring. In general, sort of spring, summer, fall is the higher risk area. But anytime you get a day that gets up above about 4 degrees, the ticks are going to start questing, sort of crawling up and looking for someone to bite. So even in the winter, when you get a bit of a thaw, they can pop up again. And you kind of really have to watch out for them. That they can survive pretty much anything. They're incredibly hardy. In fact, I just saw something today that a scientist was able to keep ticks alive in the lab for 27 years. So that, which is kind of incredible considering they only have a 3-year life cycle.
Good.
Well, also with California, I think tick season can be anytime, especially with global warming. Like my son pulled out a tick in the Sierras in January. So it's only during the summer. It doesn't hold anymore, I think. Plus, the scientists are discovering new species of tick-borne diseases all the time. We have better sort of technologies to do that. And of concern is a bunch of viruses we never knew were transmitted by ticks, like the Powassan virus, which is very deadly, and the Heartland virus. In one study in Pennsylvania, I think they found, in one park, they found 1 in 10 of the ticks had this Powassan virus.
You bring up an interesting point about the actual transmission mode for this, because it's such an interesting kind of infection route that it has and the different parts of its cycle. And I was reading the other day that they did autopsies on this group of dead deer in Idaho, I believe it was, Idaho, Iowa. Anyway, they did these autopsies at UPenn. 60% of the deer were infected with COVID. And the only good thing to this made me think perhaps they're going to be doing more research now into deer and what they're carrying because of this. And they don't actually know how they got it. They don't know if they got it from close proximity to hunters or how it got into that thing. So does anyone want to kind of explain? I know it's quite tricky, the transmission thing of
well, does Brian want to do that, or me? I don't know.
We probably both have this by heart. Go ahead.
Yeah, so what happens is deer is sort of like Motel 8 for ticks. So the females and males find their mates on the deers. It's also a warm place to spend the summer. So once they mate, the female drops off and lays 2,000 to 6,000 eggs in the leaf litter. And then tiny little larvae hatch and they find a small rodent to to take a blood meal, and then they get bigger and they shed, and then they go to a bigger mammal probably, or another mouse or a lizard or something like that. And every time they take a blood meal, they can transmit diseases. And then the cycle, which is usually a 2-year cycle, starts again. The thing that's really gives nightmares to Lyme patients is hearing that deer carrying COVID. And the big scientific question is, will the ticks harbor the COVID virus, since they carry so many other viruses, and transmit it to other animals or humans? I mean, scientists need to deal with that question, but when I read that study about COVID in deer, I emailed the researcher and said, hey, can you please take the ticks off the deer that you are analyzing and send it to? There's a really good tick lab in Pennsylvania, and they can grind them up and do DNA sequencing, because that's a really important question. As Nev can say, diagnosing people with multiple tick-borne diseases is highly challenging, because the symptoms are all over the place depending on what combo you have. So adding COVID to the mix would be an even greater nightmare for physicians.
Somebody's got a question they've just jumped in with. What is the opinion of you about insect shield? They will treat your clothes, lasts for 70 washes. Oh my goodness. Have you ever heard of that?
I have had a lot of my patients who are outdoor lovers of the outdoors use that company, because it makes it easy for people to get their clothes treated. And so
I've heard of it.
I've heard of it.
Amazing.
Now, I wanted to bring something up, if that's okay with you, Mary, about just to go back to what Brian and Chris were alluding to with, ticks are spreading, and all this, with the climate change every year, there's more and more territory that's being affected. But the gap in knowledge between physicians who are on the front lines trying to understand what the patient's presenting with, and I think Brian was mentioning, sometimes Canadian patients unfortunately have to travel to the US, and it's very costly. And, Chris mentioned it was $60,000 for her and her husband to get the proper treatment. And people can't afford that. They can't afford to travel. Sometimes they're too sick, the finances, they're exhausted. And so what we have discovered at Invisible International, that's our nonprofit, where we have married, academic physicians and scientists with community physicians and innovators from MIT and Berkeley in California, to try to really speed up innovation within this field. And so 24 of us are working day and night trying to figure out, okay, how do we improve diagnostics? So we're running a diagnostics incubator for companies. How do we improve treatment? So we have launched the first ever clinical repository, a database, if you will, to look at different cohorts of patients and see what kind of treatment protocol cocktails work for people, and publish big data studies. And then the one contribution that's available right now already is a rich physician CME library with education modules that doctors can take for free, and that's accredited by the American Academy of Family Physicians. And it's available at learn.invisible.international. And physicians just go on there and hear from the experts in the field about the epidemiology, how this disease persists, how does it evade the immune system, what are the treatment protocols, and everything else that they might be interested in learning. So I would warmly advise that anyone, and this works for patients, caregivers, innovators in the community, to learn more, as well as physicians who can get credit for it.
Thank you. Brian, so what happens in the body when you get bitten? Is there a kind of a different spirochetes, or that it changes its kind of appearance?
Yeah, so it's a really kind of interesting life cycle for both for the tick and for the bug, the bacteria. It sort of, once it detects that the tick is biting you, it just kind of wakes up and undergoes this kind of change where it switches a bunch of the proteins on its surface, and then moves into your body, and then just starts kind of, because it's a spirochete that it can swim essentially through your blood. It just kind of takes off and starts spreading through your whole body. And that's what the bullseye rash, which not everyone gets, and it's not a great diagnostic tool, but it's something that a lot of people know about Lyme disease. That's kind of that bullseye is kind of the showing at the beginning anyway where the bacteria is. They're kind of just ahead of that red ring. They're swimming away, and that's why you get that kind of bullseye. Or if you get the bullseye, that's why you get it. And then essentially they're just kind of it's as far as I can tell, it's not entirely clear how they cause the disease or how they cause the symptoms. It's part of it is your body reacting to it, so it's a bit of an an inflammatory reaction that gets out of control. There's potentially toxins. It's not entirely clear what the bacteria are doing, but they kind of get everywhere. There's been some signs that they can kind of hide, which is one of the reasons why, or one of the potential causes of chronic Lyme is that they can kind of hide in parts of your body that antibiotics can't reach very well, and they can kind of go dormant and then pop back up again, and how you get these flare-ups later on, where you can feel better for a while and then something can kind of trigger them to come back again.
Just popping over to Chris there for a moment. You mentioned that you thought for you that the best mode of delivery for that reason was intravenous antibiotics, because it got to places that the oral antibiotics weren't getting to. Is that right?
Right, because my infection was primarily neurological in the brain. My bite was at the base of my neck. And when you take orals and you have a healthy liver, you can't get concentrations high enough to kill all the bugs. So to me, that was key. And it took me 6 months to get back to a normal workload. When I first started treatment, I had babesiosis, which was a red blood cell parasite, and you need a different class of drugs to kill that. But I kept on relapsing. I would be healthy when I'm on antibiotics, and then I would quit them saying we're done, and then they would come back. So I would have taken IV antibiotics early, but everybody's a little bit different because they come to the disease with different genome, different set of illnesses that you bring to the party. So that's why it's really important to find a Lyme specialist who is used to seeing thousands of these patients, and the symptoms that present according to what co-infections you have. Time is of the essence with this disease, because it's just the damage it causes from this excessive inflammation is just not good for your constitutions. So I would say get to an expert and let them guide you in the treatment, because if you have a really high number of co-infections and you just treat with the massive dose of antibiotics, you're going to have a lot of toxins from the die-off, and you could be seriously ill, which I'm sure Nev has seen. I know, I've heard her stories before.
We've had a couple of questions here, which I think are quite interesting relating to that. A lot of people don't get this telltale rash. So what percentage of people, Nev, would you say do actually present with that rash, or miss the rash completely, or they just come down with full-blown Lyme and they don't know anything about having been bitten?
Yeah, so if you see the classic target rash, that's like winning the lottery. I think that the actual real target that looks like the company Target happens in less than 20% of patients. There's a great poster that Johns Hopkins folks developed with the state of Maryland, I believe, in what all the Lyme rashes could look like. And they could look like a non-painful bruise, basically. So very, something you could brush off very easily. Now, a big issue is with people who have darker skin tone, because in them, you will never see it. And it's really unfair, because in medical books, it says, oh, you see the target rash, you treat the patient's fine, great. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen that often. It's very difficult, especially say you live alone and it's in your back. Who's ever going to tell you that you have a rash there? So that's why clinical diagnosis is key. When you have a patient who was previously healthy, now presenting with a massive amount of symptoms, you should always be suspecting tick-borne illness and treating clinically, because the tests are very poor that we have right now and miss so much. So that would be very important.
Okay, somebody is asking, why are we not targeting the elimination of ticks, or are we? I assume you mean by like culling deer and stuff like that. Are they doing that up in Canada, Brian?
Well, there's a lot of, so, I mean, eliminating ticks themselves would be very difficult. I mean, there's just so many of them, they're very hardy. But there's a lot of kind of different ways that people are looking at to kind of either reduce ticks in an area or to kind of sterilize them from the disease. So there's a few interesting ones. One is culling deer. That only really works if you're on an island that deer can't get back into. And also even if you're on an island and there's a lot of people on the island who probably wouldn't want you shooting every single deer because people like deer. There's other ones that target the mice. So there was a very interesting, I guess, mouse vaccine study that's been going on where they put out these sort of bait stations. They've got this specially designed bait. They worked with Purina to develop something that the mice would like to eat. And they put this vaccine into it, an oral vaccine, similar to the way rabies vaccine is sometimes dropped from airplanes for wild animals. It's a similar sort of thing like this, although it would be kind of a bait station. And you could have sort of a 1 acre field kind of thing. Could be reduced, where you drastically reduce the level of infection in the mice and the ticks. So this vaccinates the mice. And the way the vaccine works, it also sort of gets into the tick and sterilizes the tick itself and can kill the bacteria in the tick. And so the ticks are still there, but now if you get bitten, they're hopefully not carrying the disease anymore. And it kind of interrupts the life cycle of the bacteria. So that's what kind of the most promising things that I've seen that are targeting kind of the animal side, is actually kind of trying to just get into the life cycle, interrupt it, probably at the mouse level. Or that's mouse and small mammal level. That's probably the easiest way to target it that doesn't involve shooting every single deer you see.
You're making me feel better about the fact I caught a mouse the other night. And that was why I had the trap, was, I had no problem with mice in principle, but I do know how much stuff they carry and it's not worth taking the risk. So off he went to the other land. So somebody has asked, is it true that some people have natural immunity to Lyme or other tick-borne diseases? If so, what is their secret? How would we know?
So I have heard of several folks who work, with ticks on daily basis and are collecting ticks, that they say that they actually develop an itch when a tick bites them, which is really interesting because ticks inside of their saliva have like antihistamine, and so you don't really feel and you don't have a need to itch it, and it's like the perfect vector because you don't know you were bitten. And because of that, but I have heard of several folks who have that. And then maybe because they discover it and they let go, can remove it faster, they don't get sick as much. But we certainly should be studying folks who are doing well and responding to treatment, and the ones that don't. And then also looking at the cohorts, which is the repository, the clinical database repository we're currently fundraising for. And that's to look at all these separate cohorts of patients, say somebody with Lyme and Babesia, somebody with Lyme, Bartonella, or Ehrlichia. What were they on? How are they doing? What are the outcomes? And then publish big data studies so we can say, okay, this is a protocol that works, because clinical studies are very sterilized. You can only look at one drug and one disease. So by the time you find the right cohort to study, sometimes you go over thousands of patients because you have to eliminate anybody who has any co-founding variables like co-infections. It's very difficult to study. So really the only way to look at this and develop some protocols faster is to see what the treating physicians are using as cocktail treatments for different cohorts, and then publish big data study. And that's what Tick Bites, our initiative, is trying to do.
Great. Somebody else has asked that there was a project on Nantucket which was looking at mice and deer populations. Is that still ongoing? Anybody know about that project?
Yeah, that's another very interesting one. That involves like a gene drive, which is using the CRISPR gene editing tool to make I should have reread my chapter on this before I started. But essentially, they were using gene editing technologies to again, they'd be releasing these mice that are kind of immune to the Lyme, and then that would slowly end up dropping it down. As those mice are bitten, the ticks then can't infect them, and it stops the life cycle. The last I heard when I spoke to them, they were doing a lot of very intensive community kind of consultations and deciding what they wanted to do with it, because this would involve releasing tens to hundreds of thousands of genetically engineered mice onto the island. And so you really need community. You can't just go and do that. You need everyone to be on board with that. And so I believe they're kind of at a stage now where the community decided they didn't want to do the full gene drive, which would kind of be a self-replicating thing that would keep going. But I'm not sure what they've decided finally to do. They're sort of still interested, but they're having to work very hard to bring the community along, because obviously the thought of releasing hundreds of thousands of genetically modified mice kind of, even for a good cause, that kind of is a bit worrying for some people. Just for
reminding me of
what could happen.
Book I read my kids, The Rats of Nim. Do you remember that book, which was all about that? It was a child's book. Anyway, were you going to jump in, Chris?
Well, yeah, I just was going to say my book Bitten talks about the unintended consequences of messing with nature and releasing hundreds of thousands of radioactive ticks for a military experiment. So a lot of times humans, we have hubris and we don't fully think about a problem where we couldn't possibly think of everything that could go wrong. So that's what I hope my book is, a precautionary tale before we do experiments like that without really doing controlled studies. So anyways, that makes me nervous.
One thing I just wanted to say, going back to nature was way more balanced when we had predators. When the eagles and coyotes and the wolves existed and they took care of the smaller mammals. Now we have obliterated the predators and we're suffering the consequences, and we've heated up the planet. Now we have gotten rid of the predators. So going back and thinking about how do you thoughtfully reintroduce predators, kind of like the Wolves of Yellowstone documentary, how do you do that as a humanity and really allow nature to function as it should, will help us as well.
So we've only got a few minutes left. I just wanted to mention, Chris, you quote two radically different approaches really in dealing with this in terms of treatment. This is the basic Lyme now, I'm not talking about all the other manifestations that you can have. And the Infectious Diseases Society of America, so the website for that is IDSA. They will offer you a 6-week solution, which is the antibiotics, oral antibiotics. And then the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society, ILADS, they go for a combination of antibiotics and probiotics and more than one course. I think that I've got that right? They're the two kind of major choices you have.
Yeah, and the first group is mostly written by academic researchers who, like Neb was saying, they study one germ in one person, and they also have taken on the role as stewards of antibiotic overuse. So they're hesitant to say, well, you need to take antibiotics for a year. And so they end up being the antibiotic cops. My family personally experienced both protocols, and the IDSA, you get 2 to 4 weeks of antibiotics, 2 to 6 weeks, and you're done. It didn't work twice for us. So that's why we decided to leave the system and go to a tick specialist. But it depends on the person and what stage, how long you've had it.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of assure people that they may not have an instant success with one treatment of antibiotic. It may not do it, right? It may be that this requires multiple treatments.
Yeah, and if you look at another crafty microbe AIDS, it's a standard of care that they treat with drug cocktails, multiple drugs at once. And in the US, there have only been 7 NIH funded trials. and they were all monotherapies, one drug. So I think what Nev is saying, that the tick bites, gathering clinical information, which has been lost because we don't have, codes for chronic Lyme, from the people that had the most success on the front lines, is a good way to accelerate that knowledge to all physicians.
Well, we're almost down to the wire here. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. We've got less than a minute. I thoroughly encourage everyone to use the links that we're going to post on the website, and not to be dismayed or discouraged by this, because it's an awful chronic condition. I've got a couple of friends with it and they've had it for years. So there is hope on the horizon. We don't want to leave you in a state of panic and fear about this. And obviously this program was hopefully helpful. So I want to thank all the wonderful guests that made time to be part of the discussion today. Chris Newby, Brian Owens, and Dr. Nev from all parts of the country and beyond, that hopefully have enlightened you and at least given you some tools to start with, books, websites. So thanks for all the work you've done. And thank you to everyone who chimed in and took part in the discussion today. It was a lot of you. So Cambridge Forum is made possible by generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, Cambridge Community Foundation, and you. So if you'd like to donate or sign up, please go to our website, www.cambridgeforum.org. You'll find a podcast of this program and many other forums, as well as video links to programs and access to a large collection of digitized classic recordings. We produce an NPR broadcast of this forum weekly, and a video of today's program will be uploaded to YouTube shortly, courtesy of GBH Forum Network. So we thank them for that. The next forum is going to be about Black History Revisited, and will be a special event to celebrate our newly digitized collection of Black seminal voices taken from our archives, ranging from Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, Toni Morrison. Pretty amazing stuff. Anyway, details of that will be posted on our website shortly. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us and see you all soon. Thank you.